Hi, today we're going to read a slightly shortened version of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. The Communist Manifesto is easily one of the most important pieces of writing in the last 200 years. It changes the world, undeniably. It's responsible for revolutions around the world, a few of which were successful. And most importantly to history, arguably, are the revolutions in Russia, in China, and then slightly less, perhaps, important in Cuba. Those are the successful ones, at any rate. Also, let's not forget Vietnam, Cambodia as well. So, the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It begins. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. And right here in this first sentence, Marx and Engels have a groundbreaking idea. You see, before Marx and Engels, there were other theorists about what creates change in history. And this is the big question. What creates change in history? How does history evolve, if you will, to take a Darwinian, or a lot of people knew about evolution before Darwin. He just creates natural selection. But anyway, what creates change in history? Well, originally, most folks are religious around the world, and they say God creates change in history. And then you fast forward a few thousand years, and in comes Hegel, talking after Napoleon has nearly conquered the world and then been defeated. And he says, no, it's great men that change history, although the great men are helped by what he calls the world spirit. So again, you have sort of this some kind of deity, supernatural force that sees a time in the world when things need to change, and they find this great man who can act as a vessel for the world spirit, like a wellspring, and out flows the world spirit through the great man, and then you have change. Well, Marx and Engels have a totally different idea. And one of the things that Marx incorporates into his philosophies, and also his anarchist buddies like Bakunin, who we'll also talk about, incorporate into their philosophies, which is also groundbreaking, is atheism, right? One of Marx's famous quotes is religion is the opiate of the people. Marx argues that religion is like a drug that makes people stupid, and therefore they don't realize how horribly their lives suck. And therefore the governments can use religion like a drug to control their people and keep them ignorant about the horrible oppression that the governments put on them day to day. As in, your life is horrible now, but don't worry about it, because the fact that your life is bad doesn't matter, because as long as you're a good person, things are going to be awesome after you die. Right? You're going to go to heaven. So anyway, Marx says, no, history is not about God. No, history is not about great men. History is about class struggle. Right? Changes in history are caused by two classes fighting each other, and the classes change over time. Okay, so here we go. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, there's some Roman history in there, lord and serf, here we have the Middle Ages, guildmaster and journeyman, Middle Ages again. In a word, oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterpreted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstruction of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. So either society is rebuilt totally and you have a new organization of classes, or both the classes totally get destroyed and society is laid waste. You know, like when the barbarians come in and take out the Roman Empire. The other interesting thing here is this idea that you have two opposing forces, you could call them the thesis and the antithesis or antithesis, coming together and creating something completely new, the synthesis, is also called like a Marxist dialectic. The dialectic, which comes back, I think, from Aristotle in ancient Greece originally, but this idea that two opposing things can come together and through debate, you know, if you will, or combat, like as Marx says, can create something new, retaining some parts of both of the old opposing forces, is the historical dialectic. And Marx doesn't use this word, but a lot of people use this when talking about Marx. So at any rate, in the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold graduation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves, in the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradation. So all that means is back in the day, right before 1848, when this thing is published, there were many classes all competing against each other. It's a big mess, right? The modern bourgeois society that is sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms, but it has established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Okay, so bourgeois, right? Big word you got to understand if you want to understand Marx. Bourgeois, bourgeoisie, proletariat. Bourgeois is urban, wealthy, non-noble, right? Essentially, Marx is writing about the effects of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution totally changes society. More than any revolution in history, the American Revolution pales in comparison, Russian Revolution, French Revolution, all these revolutions are nothing compared to the Industrial Revolution. Completely changes the way people interact, people live, people move, the geography, blah, 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 right? The Industrial Revolution changes everything. People go from living in one community for their whole lives, working the land, farming, or if they have a skill, it's passed on from father to son, passed on from guildmaster to apprentice, to moving into cities packed together with lots of people, unskilled labor, doing the same thing over and over and over again, and now looking for money, which they can then buy what they need, as opposed to working the land, getting the food that they need directly from there. So Industrial Revolution changes everything. Most important revolution in history, in my opinion. Okay, so bourgeois, those are the guys, according to Marx, that own everything, right? The proletariat, those are the workers, they work for the bourgeois. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinctive feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat, who I just explained. Each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by a corresponding political advance of the class. So, as the bourgeoisie gains economic power, economic is the division and use of resources supplied by the earth, they get political power, which is the distribution of power among any particular group of people. So, Marx is not the first guy, but he makes this really important link that as you get richer, you get more political power. So you get control over countries when you get control over businesses. And this is what happens in the Industrial Revolution. Marx is spot on here. And if you want to understand modern society and how big corporations run elections, look at Marx, right? If you get money, you can buy the political power, right? And this wasn't true before the Industrial Revolution. Not that nobles had lots and lots of money, but essentially their wealth came from land, whereas Marx realizes that the wealth of the bourgeoisie comes from making profits from businesses, then reinvesting the profits in capital, hence capitalism, which then allows them to quickly expand their businesses and make more and more money. Nobles were more interested in spending their money on lavishness, on comforts, on things that they could hang on their walls, on bigger palaces, they could show their buddies, sort of compete with each other about what they owned. Capitalists interested in expanding business, making more money. Okay. An oppressed class under the sway of the feudal nobility. This is where the bourgeois begins. You know, they're the guild masters, the shop owners, the little businesses, and they're oppressed by the nobles in feudal society. An armed and self-governing association in the medieval commune, as these places sort of broke off and became independent, of the feudal lords. Here, independent urban republic, as in Italy and Germany, where you have actual cities ruling themselves. There, taxable third estate of the monarchy, as in France. We've talked about that in the French Revolution. The bourgeois, part of the third estate, the least amount of political power, but, you know, some of the biggest money before the revolution. Afterwards, in the period of manufacture proper, after the Industrial Revolution is in full swing, serving either the semi-feudal or the absolute monarchy as a counterpose against the nobility. So the kings used the bourgeoisie and their power against other competing nobles. And in fact, cornerstone of the great monarchies in general. You know, originally all this money is used by the monarchies before the bourgeois overthrow the monarchies. The bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself in the modern representative state exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. Okay, again, groundbreaking Marxist analysis. This is what he hands us to history. His ideas about revolution, right, they all end up being wrong. He has some real flaws in what he says, and this is why the communist nations eventually collapse in on themselves, besides the fact that other nations like America supplied billions and billions of dollars and weapons to help that collapse happen. But Marx has a lot of flaws, but here again he's right. Essentially what he says is that the French Revolution and the American Revolution and all the modern revolutions that overthrow kings essentially put the bourgeoisie in power, right? And for the most part, totally spot on. Who runs modern countries? Big business, big corporations. They take the political power away from the kings and use it for themselves. Okay. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. And here is where he's kind of talking about imperialism, right? Once the bourgeois take over, they use imperialism, established well before these revolutions, to gain new resources, gain new markets, to continually make bigger profits. Think globalization of business. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjugation of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, like making canals, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? The Industrial Revolution creates more consumer goods and more goods than any other revolution or economic reorganization in history. There is just so much stuff out there produced by the Industrial Revolution, causes huge population explosions, lots and lots more food, lots more clothes, all kinds of stuff, right? More than anybody could possibly imagine. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, i.e. capital, is developed, in the same proportion is the proletariat, the modern working class, developed a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, who work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity, like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes, changes, of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. Okay, so here we shift, right, from Marx's analysis of history, right, to Marx's analysis of what's happening right now. And essentially, he's going to say that as the bourgeoisie get richer and richer and gain more political power through these revolutions and conquer the entire world, seeking resources and markets, at the same time, all those guys who work in factories, their lives become more horrible and more horrible and more horrible. They're only worth anything as long as their labor is needed. And they're only worth the lowest amount that the bourgeoisie can pay them to keep up their productive forces. These guys, and he'll say this, you know, as we move on, become essentially cogs in a machine, gears in a wheel. Their tasks are about as menial and repetitive as possible, and they get no money, right? Okay. Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workmen. Work sucks now because you're just pulling a lever, pushing a button, mining some coal, right? Instead of seeing the production of a product from its beginning to its end with lots of skill, intensity, etc., etc. He becomes an appendage of the machine, like a limb. And it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for his maintenance and for the propagation of his race. In other words, because there's so many workmen and their skills are so easy to learn and they're so readily available, they need no talent at all, that you only need to pay them as much as it costs for them to eat and reproduce, right? Because if one guy wants more money, then the guy behind him is starving and he will work for food and to feed his family, right? But the price of commodity and also of labor is equal to its cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases, right? So as the work becomes more horrible and simple, the wage goes down, right? So people's lives are worse and they're poorer, right? Nay, more, in proportion as the use of the machinery and division of labor increases, in the same proportion the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of the working hours, by increase of the work enacted in a given time, or by the increased speed of machinery, etc., etc. So the more machines in factories, the worse workers' lives are, the less they get paid, the more they suffer, starve, etc., etc. Modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of labor crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they the slaves of the bourgeois class in the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, the overlooker, and, above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. The more openly despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and more embittering it is. So, and this is a really interesting analysis by Marx, because the revolutions, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, all the democratic revolutions that washed through Europe, their aim oftentimes is democracy, freedom of choice, right? To free the human will from the oppression of kings and nobles. But interestingly, because these things hinge on the wealth of the industrial capitalist, the bourgeois, whose money fuels these revolutions, and because the revolutions are quickly followed by more mechanized industrialization, these countries become free, right? Freedom of speech, freedom to vote, all of those things, freedom to move about as you want. But the lives of the individual people become more like slave labor, because the jobs that they can get are ruled over by business owners who run their corporations like the army or like a military, right? With a very strict hierarchy, right, of power within the business, and the laborers, where they spend most of their time during the day, 10 hours a day, 6-7 days a week, have absolutely no freedom. So this is why Marx makes this analogy that working in these factories is like slave labor. And he's pretty spot on this analysis too. And of course, you could quit if you were a laborer, but if you quit, there's no other better jobs available and your family is going to starve back home. Okay. The less the skill and exertion or strength implied in manual labor, in other words, the more modern industry becomes developed. The more is the labor of men superseded by that of women. Differences of age and sex no longer have any distinctive social validity to the working class. And here you see Marx, like pretty much every other male writer and philosopher at his time, is a huge misogynist. We'll see for the first time how his buddy, who goes in a different direction politically, Mikhail Bakunin, the anarchist, is one of the first people that actually says, hey, guess what? Women are equal and as good as men. Marx, not so much. And he says differences of age, right? Marx is talking about child labor, right? Anybody can pull a lever, even a little kid. All are instruments of labor, more or less expensive to use according to their age and sex. You can hire a woman or a child for cheaper than a man, so let's use them too. No sooner is the exploitation of the labor by the manufacturer so far at an end that he receives his wages in cash than he is set upon by the other portions of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker, etc. So, when he's talking about the individual lives of these laborers, once you get paid for this horrible toil that you do and you get paid very little, immediately you have to pay out other members of the bourgeoisie class who own the food industry, who own all the apartments around, and so they take your money and you're left with nothing except just enough to eat so you can get up the next morning and go back to the factory. But with the development of industry, the proletariat not only increases in number, it becomes concentrated in greater mass, its strength grows, and it feels that strength more. The various interests and conditions of life within the ranks of the proletariat are more and more equalized, in proportion as machinery obliterates all distinctions of labor, and nearly everywhere reduces wages to the same low level. The growing competition among the bourgeois and the resulting commercial crisis makes the wages of the workers ever more fluctuating. The unceasing improvement of machinery, ever more rapidly developing, makes their livelihood more and more precarious. The collisions between individual workmen and individual bourgeoisie take more and more the character of collisions between two classes. Thereupon, the workers begin to form combinations, trade unions, against the bourgeoisie. They club together in order to keep up the rate of wages. They found permanent associations in order to make provision beforehand for these occasional revolts. Here and there, the contests break out into riots. So, Marx is saying that while the lives of the workers are being made more and more horrible, factories also, by the nature of how they're constructed, take all of these people, treat them all equally horribly, and then pack them together in the smallest possible space, right? So what's going to happen? They're going to talk to each other. They're going to express their anger together, right? And they're going to feel the power of the group. So they're going to get together, they're going to form some trade unions, and they're going to collectively bargain sometimes, try to get higher wages, and if they don't get what they want, sometimes they're going to fight. There's going to be riots. And here is where Marx is leading us towards the idea of the communist revolution, that he believes is inevitable. One thing about Marx is he thinks that these class struggles are going to play out in a particular way in history. It's a rather deterministic view. Okay. Now and then, the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of their battle lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of the workers. So each individual riot, each individual success for higher wages is not what's important. What's important is that the workers around the world become more and more united together. This union is helped on by the improved means of communication that are created by modern industry, and that places the workers of different localities in contact with each other. It was just this contact that was needed to centralize numerous local struggles, all of the same character, into one national struggle between classes. But every class struggle is a political struggle. So what he's saying also, these factories are all connected by telegraph lines, right? So not only can you feel like you're part of a brotherhood within a factory of a bunch of oppressed people packed together, but you can also communicate very quickly with a telegraph and printing press, which has been around for hundreds of years, all around the world, right? So you can unite together. The organization of the proletarians into a class and consequently into a political party is continually being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves. But it ever rises up again, stronger, firmer, mightier. So even though the workers are competing against each other, right, for jobs, that's less important, according to Marx, than the fact that they are oppressed together and will continually find common ground that's more important than their competition for wages and jobs. It compels legislative recognition of particular interests of the workers by taking advantage of the division among the bourgeoisie itself. Thus, the 10-hour bill in England was created. Like in England, a bill that you could only work somebody 10 hours a day was passed because of the collective struggles of the workers. The essential condition for the existence and for the sway of the bourgeoisie class is the formation and augmentation of capital. The condition for capital is wage labor. Wage labor rests exclusively on competition between the laborers. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers due to competition by their revolutionary combination due to association. The development of modern industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie, therefore, produces, above all, are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. So what he's saying is, as the bourgeoisie need to expand capital, need to build more and more factories, to produce more, to make more money, to more successfully compete against each other. They are creating a condition where all their workers are packed together, treated like crap, communicating with one another. So they are creating a condition where the workers will unite and overthrow them. So the bourgeoisie creates its own gravediggers. Proletarians and communists. In what relation do the communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? So at this point, Marx is defining, if you will, the Communist Party, the group of people who politically call themselves communists, and saying, okay, what do we have to offer the proletarians as a whole around the world? The communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. So this is like his pitch, right, to the proletarians around the world, to try to unite with him and his ideas for communism. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The communists are distinguished from the other working class parties by this only: one, in the national struggles of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independent of all nationality, right? So the communists, according to Marx, do not believe in struggles between nations. They want to get the workers all around the world to unite together, right? So they don't believe in national borders. And this becomes really important later on in history, because for Marxist communism to work, or Leninist communism to work as it comes out in Russia, the communists need the resources of the entire world, right? And so communism by nature must spread. So this is one of the reasons why the West, led by America and Great Britain, fight so hard, are willing to do so many nefarious things, put weapons in the hands of so many bad people to fight communism, because communism was spreading. Communist revolutions were happening everywhere, right? Because in order for it to work, everybody's got to be a communist. The resources of the world need to be shared. Two, in the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interest of the movement as a whole, right? And so Marx, again, this is him pitching, selling his Communist Party to the workers of the world, saying that we don't represent any particular interest separate from your interest. We represent all of you, right? Sales pitch. The communists, therefore, on the one hand, are the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country. That section which pushes forward all other, On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. So Marx is saying the communists aren't just a force behind the proletarian movement, pushing it forward eventually into this revolution to take over the world for the workers, but they're also the brains behind the movement. They're the only ones who understand how the vision can become reality. So they're pretty much everything. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeoisie, supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. No big goals there. They just want to unite all the proletarians into one group, overthrow every country in the world, and unite all the political power of all the workers and divide it up among themselves. Right? Small. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeoisie property. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of the many by the few. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. Right? So essentially they're saying we have to get rid of private property because this very small group, the bourgeoisie, the minority, the 1% in today's world, if you will, own all the property, all the capital, which is what you use to produce things, factories, machines, etc. And they use that power to exploit the masses of the world. Right? And so in order to redistribute fairly the resources of the world, the bourgeois property must be taken back forcefully, and then reappropriated to the proletarians, who are the majority. We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy. So, they're going to take over, right? The proletariat, the majority, is going to become the new ruling class. And keep this in mind, right? Because Marx is going to say this, new ruling class, and then he's going to say he's going to abolish class struggles. And how he thinks that's going to happen is interesting, and also is where his theories become problematic, and eventually why communist nations turn into dictatorships. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degrees, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organized as the ruling class. So, they're going to use political supremacy, maybe democratic institutions, more likely armed revolutions. They're going to use that power, political power, to take all the property from the bourgeoisie and incorporate it into the state. Centralized control of all resources. The state owns everything, right? But then he says, whoa, but remember, the state in this case is just simply the proletariat as a whole. So when the state owns everything, actually what it means is we own everything, right? And this becomes problematic. I.e. the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. So the state, the proletariat, is going to take over all the property and use them to produce as much stuff as possible to make sure that everybody has everything that they need. Idealistic. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property. Okay, really important sentence right here. Because he's talking about, in the end, he's talking about the redistribution of everything to make everybody equal. Very kind of a utopian idea, right? But then he says, okay, realistically, the only way we can get to this utopian ideal is through despotic inroads. Okay, what's a despot? A tyrant, a totalitarian leader, right? So he's saying, of course, the only way we're going to get the property of the bourgeoisie is if we take it by force. The only way we can achieve this democratic utopia where everybody has what they want is to form a government that looks a lot like a dictatorship, and they're going to use that dictatorial power to take all that stuff from the bourgeoisie. Then they're going to redistribute it equally, right? And we're all going to live happily ever after, if you will. And this point is where the problems arise in every communist revolution, right? The communists can win, right? And they can take all the property. But then once they've taken all the property, then they have to equally distribute it out to everyone. And once you have all the property, once you become the new ruling class, oftentimes you don't want to give all that up, right? Unless it's to your friends and to your family. Okay. Except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeoisie production, by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which, in the course of the movement, outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. So while the despotic taking of all this property may not seem to be able to produce an economically viable society down the road, they are totally necessary, and this will work itself out in the revolutionary process. These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in the most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable. Okay, so what you have here are essentially the 10 steps to becoming a communist nation once the communists gain political power. Excuse me. Coffee, one of the great products available everywhere and cheaply because of capitalism and imperialism, probably grown from nearly slave labor in some third world country and yet enjoyed around the world everywhere else by wealthier folks like myself for pennies. Okay, step 1, abolition of property in land and the application of all rents of land to public purchases. So you take all the land from everybody, right? And as the state rents the land out to people, then the money will go back to the people. So the state will take all the property, then rent it out to folks, and then use the money they get from the rent to provide other public services, you know, transportation, healthcare, military, that kind of stuff. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. And as we read these further, right, those of you who watch this in the East, right, think about how many of these steps your country has already taken. And those of you who are watching this in the West, think of these same steps. My Chinese students, who are supposedly ruled by a communist party, one-party rule, think of how many things you have that are familiar from this list. And then my American students, think about how many of these things we have in America. And what you will find out is, as far as Karl Marx is concerned, China and America are very similarly communists, right? And I'm not saying that because I want to say, you know, America's being taken over by communists, you know, let's beat the political drums. No. What America has done, and many Western nations have done to avoid a communist revolution, is to actually incorporate much of Marxist ideology, policy into their countries. And we've benefited from it, right? The creation of the middle class is by adopting, arguably, a lot of Marx's ideas. Okay, so, heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Guess where we have that? Right here in the USA. Abolition of all rights of inheritance. So that means Marx says you can't inherit any property. And really inheritance is the cornerstone of unearned wealth, right? I mean, essentially they mean the same thing, right? So if you want to get rid of the power of the bourgeoisie, you can do it in one generation. Just take all the money after they die, right? And give it out equally. Okay, and you can imagine lots of people have a huge problem with this. Well, here in America, we have rights of inheritance, but what do we do with that inheritance? Ever heard of the death tax, right? You get taxed based on what you inherit. This is a Marxist idea, right? And then that money can therefore be used arguably to help educate and give other less fortunate people more rights or more ability to become successful themselves. So take away money that people didn't earn. Confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels. An emigrant is somebody who moves away, and a rebel is somebody who's against your country, right? Do they take away the property of criminals in China? Sure they do. Do they take away the property of the criminals in America? Yes, they do, right? So this is something we also have in common. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. So one bank, right, that controls the money supply in your country, right? In China, you have a central bank. In America, we have the Fed, which are two different organizations, and that the Fed is a whole other subject, essentially. But Marx realizes, as do the folks who created the Federal Reserve, that the people who control the money supply in a country control much of the power in the country. And if you want to be able to manipulate the economy, arguably for the good of anyone, what you must control is the money supply and financing, the ability to loan out that money, right? And increasing the money supply in America is one of the cornerstones of our recent, in the last 50 years, economic booms. Although it has many, many other problems, which we'll get to in other times. Okay. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state, right? Like, think the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, controls the airwaves and sells them out. Think of city buses controlling transportation. Think of federal regulation of airlines, right? This happens in many, many countries, right? If the state controls transportation, hopefully people can move about easier and more cheaply, and therefore find jobs when they need to, and increase their own ability to make money and provide for themselves. So we got it here, they got it there. Another communist idea that we've adopted. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with the common plan, right? So own the farms, own the factories, try to get more and more as you can, and centrally plan your production of food and of resources. This is something we do a lot less over in America and the West, although we do it, and corporations certainly do this, than happens in more communist countries. Equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Everybody has to work, right? Is what Marx is saying here. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable would work also there, distribution of the population over the country. So more suburbias, less congested cities, less totally open pastures and farmland. Number 10, free education for all children in public schools. Guess where we have that? Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. We've done that. Combination of education with industrial production. Think vocational education, etc., etc. When, in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation. This vast association of the whole nation, this is what never happened after these communist revolutions. Power was retained by the people who overthrew the government. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. If the proletariat, during its contest with the bourgeoisie, is compelled by the force of circumstances to organize itself as a class, if, by means of revolution, it makes itself the ruling class, and as such sweeps away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms and of class generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class. The most idyllic utopian statement in this reading. Essentially, Marx says, after the proletarians organize themselves into a revolutionary force, and they take over governments and then take all the property, then in some feat of altruism, these leaders who have led the charge to take all this property will then use their power to give up all their power and redistribute everything equally, right? And this is where Marxist ideology is wrong, or where it hasn't worked out anyway. Essentially, once people take all the property, they want to keep it, and that's one of the major problems with communism. In place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. In short, communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. In all these movements, they bring to the front as the leading question in each the property question, no matter what its degree of development at the time. Getting the property is the most important. Finally, they labor everywhere for the union and agreement of the democratic parties of all countries. Bring these guys together for the world revolution. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. You can see why people are afraid of these folks. Let the ruling class tremble at the communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of the world, unite. Questions?